The Zink Bikes Vacay is unapologetically Cam Zink's idea of the ultimate bike, but what does that mean for more regular riders like myself? Stay tuned to find out in this review on loamwolf.com. Let's go. I love how Cam Zink is so unapologetic when it comes to this bike and saying this isn't your all-around bike unless all you do is play. But I can't play all of the time, so I was really interested to find out how this bike would be as a bike for one person to go playing, to go hit some huge jumps, to go attack the trail and to do some poppy, jibby maneuvers, but still have to live with it on the day-to-day where you might be finding yourself on some slightly more technical terrain from time to time and having to pedal it up the hill. This is 150mm rear travel as standard, although using a shorter stroke shock you can go down to 140mm in the rear using a horse link setup with what Zink calls their lift technology. This is all designed around giving the rear end as little chain growth, as little change in length as possible as you move through the travel. So they got the lower pivot as close to the bottom bracket as they could in order to give you what they consider to be the largest balance point. So where you think of a high pivot design constantly changing through its travel and moving where that balance point is in the rear suspension as you compress it, instead this is the antithesis of this, where it's just designed around making things really nice and predictable, making it slightly easier to keep your balance when you're on the back wheel, as well as making it a little bit more reactive when you're trying to use the rear end to get the front end up, whether that be for popping over a log, for pulling a manual, or for doing a flat drop backflip, if that's your kind of game. Certainly not mine. Up front, it's paired as standard with a 160mm travel fork, although it can be put down to 140 or 150mm if you're going for a more dual slalom sort of setup, or up to a 170 single crown, or even a 180mm travel RockShox Boxer up front if you're looking for a front end that's going to be capable of taking the biggest possible hits. And then depending on what your preferences are, if you're going for a more freeride setup, you can run it with dual 27.5-inch wheels, or you can run it as a mixed wheel setup or moto setup with the 29-inch wheel up front, as I've got it here. Using the flip chip in the rear shock, you can also adjust the geometry. It's got a high and a low position with the standard flip chip, and there's also a different flip chip that you can use to get a middle position, meaning that you can tweak the handling of the bike to your preferences to suit the terrain on the menu of the day. Other features include a choice of internal or external cable routing, which means everyone's going to get their preference, although it does lead to a little bit of an industrial look. You've got space in there to get a mid-size water bottle, and otherwise this is just a fairly typical run-of-the-mill aluminium frame. It weighs in around about 3.5 kilos, or just under the 8-pound mark without a shock, so it's certainly in the realms of what you would consider typical in the aluminium bike space. Rounding things out, you've got a standard ZS4456 head tube, meaning that you can run an external angle set or the internal headset for a nice clean setup up front like I've got here. And then the frames are designed to accommodate a fairly long travel dropper, with this size medium that I tested fitting a 200mm dropper slammed typically, or a 250mm dropper like I've got fitted here with a little bit showing out of the frame. The Vacay can be purchased as a frame only for around about $1,650 or £1,300 without a shock. And then Zink also makes other build kits available, with either a fairly basic build coming in at around about $4,000, or Cam Zink's dream build spec coming in at just under the $7,000 mark. I was sent the Troy Lee Special Edition paint job bike as a frame only to test, which is a couple of $100s more. And with all the frames you get a really nice special touch in that Cam Zink's personal signature is adorned on the bottom of the seat tube there, which is really nice to see, and just a testament to Cam himself checking over all the frames to ensure that the quality that's going out is up to his standards. I put together what I considered a pretty appropriate build to strike a balance between freeride capabilities and still being enduro friendly. It's a collection of either parts that I had already or stuff that I've had on test, from the SRAM 90 Eagle drivetrain, the RockShox Reverb 250 dropper post, Suntour Duralux 38 and Tri-Air 2 suspension combo, and then SRAM's Motive brakes. There's a Hunt Enduro Wide V3 wheel set on test, and then I put a Raceface turbine stem with a Bergtech Ride High 50 bar, adorned with the Sensus light grips, which felt appropriate given that Sensus is a company owned by Cam as well. All in all, the build came in at around about the 16 kilo mark, or 36 pounds, which, given its fairly burly nature, I'd say is well within the realms of acceptable. But what does this super unique bike translate into when you take it out onto trails, both bike park and big freeride hits, as well as more natural and rough and rugged enduro trails? Let's talk about how this bike performed. At 6'2" or 189 centimeters, I opted to test the size medium in the Vacay, and even the Zink crew themselves were a little bit reluctant to give me that size in initially, but once I explained that not only are my proportions slightly favoured towards a shorter reach bike than would be typical for my height, but also that I really wanted to lean into what the perceived strengths of this bike would be, instead of trying to force it to be a more stable and more enduro appropriate bike for myself. So I opted to go for the size medium. It turned out to be a really nice fit. I was really comfortable and really happy with the overall feeling that the bike delivered for me. But it's important to talk about the geometry of this bike before we get into the main review. Now, Zink didn't play it safe with this bike by any means. In fact, he managed to spec potentially the shortest chainstay on the market. At 420 millimeters on the size small and medium, this thing is really slammed in the rear end, which gives it a very unique handling characteristic. It means it's not going to be a bike for everyone. It means it's not a bike that naturally gives you a bunch of stability and front wheel weighting. And it does, as a result, require a slightly different riding approach if you're riding in more technical terrain. But the flip side of that is that this bike manuals so easily, it gets up onto the back wheel so well, and it's just an absolute blast to ride, and I've absolutely loved taking this bike out both onto more technical stuff and into more bike park scenarios. Otherwise, the geometry is fairly typical of what you would expect for a modern, all-mountain enduro bike, and as a result, it is just that rear end that you need to kind of think about when you're riding, but the rest of the package doesn't give you any strange sensations. Things like the reach are going to be fairly typical for a size medium rider if you go for the appropriate sticker size, or really just tailor the reach to the kind of figures that you're used to working with and the figures that work for you. But yeah, you're just not going to end up with a wildly out there bike. It's just a bike that is fairly familiar, except for the front end comes off the ground very easily. And yeah, as long as you adjust your riding technique to account for that, I think a lot of riders are going to be able to get on this bike and have a surprisingly good time. It actually wasn't a surprise that I had a good time on this bike. I do ride a little bit of BMX in my spare time, or at least I pretend to, and I love a little bit more of a playful overall approach to riding, especially if you're on a bit of equipment that kind of channels you towards doing so. Then I'm quite happy turning down the speed a little bit and instead focusing on popping and playing and manualing and jibbing and just doing all of those kind of fun things on the trail instead of going after race clock times. So getting the Zink was really quite refreshing to have that in my stable, to be able to go out and hit the trails and just apply a little bit more of a freeridey, BMX inspired approach to how I ride them, especially on my local trails around here in the Tweed Valley in Scotland, where it's definitely not the kind of place where you're going to find many more freeride inspired riders coming out. But if you do apply a little bit more of a playful approach to how these trails work, then it's actually impressive what you can kind of find if you just slow down your overall thought process and try and find the little side hits and try and find the little gaps to make and manuals to get in between different obstacles. It's a huge amount of fun, and I really have had a super fun time testing the Zink Vacay. Climbing this bike was always going to be interesting. I was really concerned actually that this was not going to be a bike that I'd be able to climb. I've been really quite surprised by just how pleasant
the Zink Vacay is to climb. I really thought it was going to be sure, you can climb this bike, but you're not really going to want to. Whereas in reality, especially if you've got a shock like the Suntour unit that I've got on here, you can get away with it. And good seating position, reasonable amount of control. I think they're very smart to give it a nice upright seating, you know, seat tube angles nice and steep. Really just makes a lot easier to handle on the way up the hill, a lot more pleasant to climb, meaning that spots like here, Glenlivet in Scotland, where the trails have nice climbs to get up to the top of them, you really don't hate being on this bike at all. Just spin your legs, get up to the top comfortably, cover some good ground, and then really enjoy yourself on the way back down. Thoroughly surprised, impressed by the Zink Vacay as a general purpose full suspension mountain bike.
The suspension platform is not going to do you too many favours. If you run a shock without a climb switch, then the rear end of this does bob a lot under your own power. Because I am on a size medium and the seat angle is fairly steep, it is quite cramped in the cockpit for me. But otherwise, this isn't a bike that is absolutely horrible to pedal as long as you've got a switch on the shock to help firm things up a little bit. The rear end does make things a little bit more tricky when the going gets very steep. It does mean that the front end can be prone to coming a little bit light when you're on the steeper pitches of climb, but it's not totally unmanageable, and as long as you set your aspirations not to be climbing the most technical and steep and awkward climbs, and instead just spinning your legs to get up a fire road climb to then come down a more freeride inspired descent, then I think you'll actually be quite surprised just how well the Zink Vacay can climb for you. Being able to fit in that 250mm drop RockShox Reverb Axis dropper, which by the way is a fantastic bit of kit, meant that I was able to get loads of clearance for the descents, but not compromise on my climbing position when I was going back up the hill. And this really made a huge difference. Of course, not many riders are going to run a saddle height quite as high as I do, so I would maybe suggest that you really check to make sure that you're going to get the length of dropper that you want in this frame. But with a size medium clearing a 200mm dropper comfortably slammed, it should mean that most riders are going to be able to get an adequately long travel dropper to keep them happy. And on the way down the hill, obviously I've alluded to the playfulness of the Zink Vacay, and if you're a free rider or just general jibby rider or looking for a very playful bike, then setting this thing up fairly firm is likely to keep you really happy. But in the interest of making a complete review, I did take it from the original more freeride inspired setup and tried to make it more of an enduro and all-round capable bike. I softened things up and tried to really lean into a more traction-rich approach where it would just be able to, take the sting out of a trail and be a little bit more competent and comfortable on the way down more rough and rowdy descents. And it was actually quite surprising just how well I was able to get this bike to perform outside of its geometry. The geometry does not lead to a naturally capable and confident bike for trying to push hard and fast on super technical trails, because you do end up with the slight instability caused by the lighter front end because of the shorter rear end, meaning that you just struggle to find the balance to keep the weight on the wheels that you need and keep the traction. That's not to say it's impossible, but I wouldn't say this is a bike that's going to set any personal records relative to other bikes in the more enduro space. But of course, Cam Zink never intended this bike to be an enduro race bike, and it was impressive. Even so, not necessarily the speed that I was able to get down enduro trails, but the caliber of enduro trail that I was able to get down on this bike without being completely uncomfortable. It will still go down rough and rowdy, steep and technical enduro trails without too much of a concern. And the overall suspension platform, once you soften things up, actually helped to take the sting out of the trail fairly well. As such, this was a bike that was a little bit more well-rounded than I was expecting, and a bike that I had a huge amount of fun on, no matter where I was out riding for the day. Looking at the quality of this bike, and there's certainly some aspects of it that are a little bit more industrial than sleek and premium. The optional cable routing means that, it's just a little bit less, sleek finished and feels just a slightly bit outdated. And there's certain aspects of how it's all put together that are just a little bit rougher around the edges than some of the super premium bikes out there. But in the mid-level aluminium frame space, I wouldn't say it stands out as being particularly poor quality by any means. And the result out on the trail, the overall feelings of being dialed were certainly there. There was nothing that creaked throughout testing. There was no concerns with any hardware backing out or just any quality issues whatsoever. The only one being the rear end not coming with any chainstay protection means you're going to have to fit your own if you want this bike to run quietly and to protect the paintwork on that rear end. And perhaps that the paint quality overall wasn't quite up to the standards of some of the other brands out there. And then there was the unfortunate instance where on an uplift service in the UK where bikes are strapped to trailers on the back of Land Rovers and towed up the hill, one of the other bikes on the uplift did fall off and had itself rubbing against this frame. So sadly the bar end scratched up the paintwork up by the head tube. It managed to scratch the stanchion of the fork. It managed to scratch the first shock that I had on it, which then led it to losing air, which was just a bit of a disaster and really unfortunate, and by no means a fault of the Zink bike. But that's the explanation for why the paint is weird up by the head tube. I did try and Sharpie it in to just take a little bit of the overall appearance out of it. But yeah, otherwise, this thing's put together fairly well. It's not going to be the bike, I don't think, in the wet conditions is going to stand up to the test of time quite as well as some of them out there. Just the frame pivots are not quite as well sealed as the best of them. But if you're a rider who's just looking to absolutely charge, send some massive jumps, the overall feelings of stiffness and reassurance that the Zink Vacay provides really lead me to believe that it's going to stand up to the test of time. And Zink backs it with a lifetime warranty as well, so that you can send it without having to think about it too much. Overall, if this is a bike that speaks to you, I think that it's absolutely worth considering as your purchase, because not only is it so fun in the right kind of terrain where you're trying to pop and play, and I believe it would flat drop backflip better than most bikes out there. Not that I'm ever going to test that, but yeah, it does that aspect well, but it's still nice to live with on a more day-to-day basis. And it's just been an absolute riot to test, and I'm super thankful for Zink to sending me one. I hope you guys have enjoyed this review. Give us a like if you have. Leave us a comment. Let us know your thoughts on this bike, any questions that you might have. If I can't answer them, I'll reach out to Zink and they'll be able to get back to you. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more awesome content on awesome bikes like the Zink Vacay. Thank you for watching. Catch you out on the trails.
Oh my god!